You are listening to ESL Talk, a podcast made for English teachers by English teachers. Here are your hosts, Daniel and Golnaz.
Hello everyone, welcome to episode 12 of ESL Talk. We're continuing to grow week by week and thank you so much for all your support so far.
And today we have another interesting topic for you, which concerns teachers who teach English in another language or teach English as non-native or multilingual teachers. So how does the approach differ and what methods can be used that differ from the English-only or native approach? That's what we are going to discuss today.
Yeah, exactly. Why are we doing this? Because as we know, there's a huge market of teachers who need to teach beginner or low-level English learners using their L1, their first language, or blend two languages to help lower-level learners to start building their English skills. Depending on the country that you're in, these skills are really important and really valuable. So it's really vital that we know how to do this and that our teachers know how to do this. So for our interview today, we'll hear from Nastya, who's a global English teacher from Russia. She has lots of experience teaching purely in English, teaching using only her first language, Russian, and even blending the use of them for her English learners.
So, as a native teacher, Daniel, have you ever used another language to teach students English?
I would like to say no, but I have had to at times. When I was teaching in South Korea, I was also learning Korean at the same time. So I was studying at university. So there were times when I was teaching students with very little or almost zero English proficiency. So it was very difficult to communicate with them and it was very difficult to talk to them using only English. Now, I wouldn't have full conversations. I wouldn't have, lots of interaction in their language, Korean, because it wasn't my first language. But if I was listening to them and I heard them say certain things like they don't understand, they don't know what to do, how do I read this, how do I say this, it's too difficult, I can hear that in their first language and then I can respond in English. So I tried that approach. I also used it with older learners as a little bit of a gentle, I do understand what you're saying, I can understand your language, but this is English time. Let's try to use English for these 40 minutes or 1 hour or 2 hours or whatever it is. So I have used it, although I try to avoid it, but sometimes it's inevitable, as you know. So let me ask you, Golnaz, as a non-native teacher, what's been your experience in using another language to teach English?
Well, first of all, when I started teaching English in Iran, I had the same L1 with my learners. So at times and at some certain points, there were different situations that my learners used Persian, or I had to actually channel to to Farsi to actually be able to help my learners. But this really, I learned from the beginning that learners L1 should not be a taboo. It should not be feared. Learners should be comfortable with it. If some incidents happen that for any reason they use it, it should not be, frowned upon, or for example, that's my personal belief. You should have a very welcoming approach to English learners. This is really important. And for myself, being welcoming and being comfortable with my learners and making them feel comfortable is really important. So for me, it never was an issue, but I always tried different strategies and different methods. And sometimes I had to, out of the classroom, I had to talk to some of my learners and, explain the whole methodology and how the whole language learning works and why putting more emphasis on English is important and is necessary inside the classroom. Sometimes learners need to know about this stuff because, they have no idea. They just enter the classroom and they just want to learn English. And sometimes they just feel that, okay, it doesn't hurt to, speak in our mother tongue.
Yes.
I had this similar experience in Turkey as well. So it was always the trick of knowing when to use it and when not to use it. So what about you, Daniel? Do you think it is necessary to use another language to help students learn English?
Like you've just discussed, Golnaz, I think it has its value for sure. And I think that it's also, there are times when it's necessary, but it goes back to what you were just talking about students understanding the why if they know why something is important or the value of doing it a certain way and looking at the methodology and the strategy, then I think that it can be really important. Because if you just, at school, for example, you in a class and you can only use only English. Well, why? What's the method? What's the purpose? What's the motivation? And that's going to change with, younger learners and older learners. Younger learners may tend to revert more to their L1. If they're in a big group, they might feel more comfortable. So there are ways around that. If we're thinking about online teaching, it's generally not as much of an issue because students are 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 or 3-to-1. There's much less chance of them to use the L1. But there are times, even where some students I'm working with have very low proficiency or very low ability, and they have that idea or they have that word in their mind, but they can't quite articulate it. So they might just quickly look up the word and that can be useful as long as they learn from it the next time and they realize, okay, I need to remember this word or I need to use this word. And again, that all connects to context as well. Where do I use the word in what situation? So if they know the situation and they know the word, then they can start to get out of that habit. And hopefully once they enjoy, learning English, using English, and they see the value of using English only, then I think that can be really useful for them as well. But yeah, I think it's important, again, just to stress the value to students and to make them realize why it's important to use only English or the situations or the times when they can use their first language.
Definitely. And depending on situations and different situations and like what is happening, because sometimes it happens in the learning process, sometimes it happens in the teaching process, and sometimes it happens when no teaching or learning is necessarily happening. For example, when you enter the classroom, the class has not started yet, and for example, you see that learners are, for example, speaking in their L1, or I don't know, when, for example, they sometimes to teach vocabulary. This is a controversial topic, actually. For example, do we have to use one word and give it to them, or do we have to explain, I don't know, for 10 minutes of the class time to just teach one word? I mean, it really depends. And if all the learners share the same L1, or is it a multilingual classroom? That's also that also makes everything actually different. And I think it's really important as teachers to be open to different situations and to be able to make a correct judgment call. Sometimes I think there have been times, based on experience, I have seen that it is better to use the L1. But it is not, there was a reason why grammar translation did not work. Okay, so it cannot become your main method and your main approach to teaching English or to teaching any second language or foreign language. But it is, it's like a toolbox that some teachers have the L1 as a tool in their toolbox. Mm-hmm. So depending on the situation, they can choose when and when not to use it. So
yeah.
I think that's really important to consider.
I wouldn't know as much about it as you do, but I think it's, knowing that, well, if I need to, I can, or if I need to explain this more, or I need to go over something in more detail, I can. So I think that's a really useful strategy that the teachers can apply for sure. Yeah. So I also just want to bring it back to when I was learning another language. So as I mentioned earlier, when I was in Korea, I learned Korean at the university, and that was through an immersion method. Only Korean, no English. Now, most of my fellow students I knew from other places, and I was quite friendly with them, and they were American or English, or they spoke English. So we would always, like you said, before the class, after the class, we'd use English. But in the classroom, it really, really pushed us because we had to challenge ourselves. We had to find new strategies. We had to find ways to communicate if we didn't quite have the vocabulary or didn't quite have the grammar structure. So it was definitely more of a stressful environment, but because of that, I think my Korean improved exponentially. It got much better, much faster. There were times when I just couldn't communicate. I couldn't express myself, and I had to borrow an English word or use an English word. And the teacher kind of didn't acknowledge that, but she kind of would nod or just be like, yeah, okay. So then at least I could communicate that way. But it was a little bit difficult, but I think an immersion method is a really useful way. A little bit of L1 sprinkled in there. But What's your approach? Have you experienced an immersion method? Do you think that that's a suitable method for learning a language, especially if you're an adult?
Well, I learned English when I was a kid and I was a teenager. So based on my age and based on the language school that I attended, I was never exposed to Farsi or Persian that much by my teachers. I remember some cases that, for example, in some cases the teachers switched to Farsi, but it was very rare. I have some blurry images, so I cannot really say that I have experienced being taught using, for example, the foreign language and my L1. But I can say that for adult learners, because for young learners and for teenagers it can be different, but for adult learners, again, as I said, the teacher needs to decide based on the approach and based on the method that they are following and based on the whatever that they're teaching, based on the lesson, based on the class profile and everything. It would not hurt in some cases to use it, but again, not too much of it. As you said, just a sprinkle of the L1 if necessary.
Yeah, I want to kind of play devil's advocate here because I've seen it on the other side where I've witnessed English teaching in other countries, and a lot of the time there's no English being spoken, even though students are learning English. And a lot of it is rote memorization of grammar. So I'm going to explain English grammar in another language, or I'm going to explain English vocabulary in another language, or it's very, very difficult. So a lot of students that I work with, they have great writing skills. They have really good, reading skills. They can find information. They can construct things well grammatically. But when it comes to speaking, the level is so much lower because they've never had an opportunity to be able to speak, because in their schools or universities, they're not allowed to speak English. They're not allowed to have an opportunity to discuss things. So I think, there is a time and a place sometimes for using L1, but there also is a time and a place for immersion and very strict, not very, very strict, but quite strict English regulations as well, because if you're learning a language, you want to be able to speak that language. And I can read all the books, I can learn all the grammar, I can know all the words, but unless I can use them, it's kind of worthless, right? It's like I can read all the books on how to drive a car, but unless I go in the car and drive it, it's not worth anything. So it's a really tricky subject, and of course there isn't an exact correct answer or incorrect answer, but I think we're going to get into that a little bit in our interview today. So I guess we need to preface before we get into the interview that no matter what your approach is, we need to know our students, we need to know their ability, and we need to find a strategy that works well for them. Some students might benefit from a little bit of L1, some might need a lot of L1, and some might not need any L1. The skill is, as a teacher, know your students, know their level, and work within that.
Definitely, that's a very good way to put it, actually. Thank you, Daniel. So we are going to get ready for the next portion of today's podcast. Please stay tuned. We are going to have our guest, Nastya.
Hi everyone, welcome to the interview portion of today's episode. Today we have Nastya joining us. Hello, Nastya.
Hello, Daniel. Thanks for inviting me here.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. So as we usually do, let's start off with the first question today. So could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your teaching journey so far?
So my name is Nastya. I'm from Russia, Moscow. Actually, first I entered Moscow Pedagogical University and I wanted to be a translator, maybe interpreter, yeah. But then when I was in my third year, I realized that translating, it's not my thing, and I started tutoring. I had my first students, little ones, and later, I realized that it was actually what I really wanted to do in my future. And then I changed my major and graduated majoring in teaching English as a foreign language. And that's basically it. Now I'm teaching online.
So when you were learning English, did your two teachers use your L1 Russian or only English? And did this approach work for you?
It was actually both. When I was at school, our teachers, they would mix it. Sometimes Russian, then English. Then I attended some courses for teenagers, and there my first, I consider him to be my first real English teacher, and he was originally from India, and back then he had been living in Moscow for, I don't know, maybe 8 years, so he perfectly knew Russian and English as well, so he didn't use any Russian, it was only English, but well, then my level was around intermediate, so it wasn't for me a problem anyway, so...
Interesting. So what about when you started working as a teacher and teaching English? Did you teach only in English or with a combination?
Well, at first it was combination, yeah, because at first I was a translator student, and I didn't know actually anything about methodology and stuff, unfortunately. Yeah, then I learned more about communicative approach to teaching English, and I worked in an international school for adults, maybe you know it, Wall Street English, and there they use this approach where they ask their teachers not to use Russian at all, as much as we can actually. And there, at first, I practiced that approach, and I really liked it, eliciting from students answers instead of telling them it's straightforward. So I saw how well this approach worked with them, and since then I've been using it, and I try to reduce Russian as much as I can. But of course, if I have true beginners who can only say hello, my name is, sometimes, I use Russian for the sake of time. But I try as much as I can to use only English.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's really important as well, to know your learners and know their level, because if you just use only English and they have no ability, then it's going to be impossible. So Nastya, what do you think are the benefits of teaching only in English? Restart that. So what do you think are the benefits of teaching only using the student's L1? So if they're very low level and you only use the L1, what do you think are the benefits of that? Benefits?
Only L1. Oh, I guess, I can't even think of any benefits. Well, it can psychologically help them, to get to know you better as a teacher, but still, if you don't use your target language, that's a bit weird, I believe.
I know a lot of teachers and a lot of language schools, they teach in the students' L1. So why do you think that is done? Why do they do that?
Well, it's easier, I guess. And now, on Instagram, there are lots of, tons of literally teachers who have their own, methodology, special methods, unique methods, and actually they end up, just talking about English in Russian. And students can say, well, that's present simple, that's present continuous, present perfect, but actually when it comes to speaking, they can just and they can't produce anything in the end.
Yeah, it's pretty common.
So I guess.
So and with that being said, then what are the benefits of teaching only using English? As you've experienced, what did you find were the benefits of that?
Well, students get full immersion, in language itself. Then they, I guess they learn to predict. They learn to guess the meaning. They might know some phrases, some words. But still, some might be, not clear enough. But they try to get the knowledge, the idea themselves. They don't rely on teacher only. And I guess that's really helps in real life situations when, for example, you travel somewhere and you don't have your teacher by your side, and still you have to somehow, yes, live through some experience in your life.
Wonderful. So I guess kind of tying them both together, where or how can a combination of the two languages be useful? Because I guess this approach can work for lower level learners, but how can it be useful? In what ways?
Well, I guess sometimes, yeah, if you want to save time during your class and you try to listen somehow, explain using different methods, but still they don't get it, I think it's quicker just to translate sometimes. And then you can move forward with more important stuff at your lesson. But again, it depends on what are the aims of your lesson, yeah, and what you want in the end to get from them. So sometimes it can really help and be like a blessing for a teacher.
So what about your approach to teaching? Does it change when you are teaching different age groups? For example, when you are teaching younger learners or older learners or adult learners?
Well, yeah, if I teach younger learners, I try to use, more like fun ways, and than just we sing songs a lot, yeah, but actually now I prefer to teach only adults. I'm a bit tired of teaching kids because it takes too much of me, my energy, yes, to keep them focused, motivated, yeah, and motivation it's a real problem if we talk about children, unfortunately.
Yeah, I've been in that boat. I know that experience. It's very draining emotionally and mentally as well. And you also have to deal with parents, and you have another language barrier there, which can be very tricky. So again, one more question to ask you about this. How do you work with students who request English only or L1 only, even if you know their level doesn't match? So maybe students are very proficient and they still lean more towards their L1, or students have a very low ability and they want English only. How do you, deal with those challenges and avoid those conflicts?
Well, I guess I haven't had much experience in that sphere, but I do recall a student. He was a teenager back then, maybe around 14 years old or so, and I remember when, I knew that he was aware of how to say that in English, but still he would use Russian. I don't know why. I would stop him, I would argue with him, I would tell him if you keep talking in Russian, we'll end up writing translation of what you've just said in Russian. And those warnings helped a bit, but I guess since then I haven't encountered such a problem. So usually, yes, my students, they understand, yes, that they need to use English. And, of course, if they don't know how to say it in English, they might use Russian. But still, I tell him, guys, okay, you don't know past tense, but you know present. You can say this phrase in present, add just yesterday, and I get you, yeah? So the goal is to express yourself, your ideas. Later we'll deal, yes, how to say it in English, grammatically correctly. But if I understood you, that's the goal.
Thank you, Nastya. And I would like to ask you, what advice would you give to non-native teachers who want to teach learners in their own country?
Well, I guess I'd say, guys, you should develop your professional skills as much as you can, and even if you graduate from university, it doesn't mean that you're gonna know English well. Yes, you have to practice every day, follow professional teachers who are better in different aspects and learn their experience, and just never stop learning, I guess. That's the major point here.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And just to add on one final part to that, what advice would you give to new teachers in different countries who are thinking about teaching English online? You know, where should they start? Where should they begin in that journey?
I mean, just online, yeah?
Yeah.
Precisely about online teaching. Well, I guess, again, you should deal with your methodology at first. Yes, then if your level isn't high enough, then you should work on your English level, of course. Maybe find a teacher who has a higher level than you have, practice. And again, with online, it's really important to use convenient tools for teaching. Yes, I discovered for myself a really amazing tool. It's, maybe you know it, it's a Miro program. It's like online whiteboard, and it's super duper convenient for teaching. Yes, you can store your materials for all the lessons. You can both work simultaneously with your students. You can write, draw, make some notes, and yeah, it enables you to work better.
Sounds like a great tool. And what's the name of that? Miro? M-I-R-O?
Miro, yeah, like miro.com.
Okay, great tool. There we go. Great takeaway for all our listeners.
It's really convenient, yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Nastya. Okay, that wraps up our interview for today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much, yeah.
All right, guys, that'll wrap it up for today. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. I hope you enjoyed the topic and the interview. Again, we always try to cover a range of interesting topics and maybe controversial topics. So thank you always for your support. If you do want to get in touch with us, as always, you can send us an email at esltalkpodcast@gmail.com.
And please remember to follow us on Instagram and like us on Facebook, ESL Talk Podcast.
See you next week, guys. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe for new episodes and to follow us on Instagram and Facebook for even more ESL teaching content.